the great son of the Natchez people, knew he was dying. Tattooed Serpent lay on his bed of woven cane, his breath coming in shallow gasps as the Mississippi River fog crept through the walls of his dwelling atop the ceremonial mound. It was the autumn of 1725, and with him would die the last hope for peace between his people and the French who had invaded their ancient lands. His brother, the great son, supreme ruler of the Natchez, sat beside him, holding his hand. But it was not the great son who truly worried Tattooed Serpent in his final hours. It was the young warriors, hot-blooded and angry, who whispered in the night about driving the French into the river. It was men like his own nephew, a fierce warrior whose hatred of the pale-skinned invaders burned like the sacred fire that had never been extinguished in the Natchez temple for 1,000 years. "Brother," Tattooed Serpent whispered, his voice barely audible above the autumn wind, "when I am gone, you must be wise. The French are like the leaves of the forest, too many to count. If our people make war against them, it will be the end of the Natchez." The great son nodded, tears streaming down his painted face. But both men knew that Tattooed Serpent's death would remove the last voice of restraint. The French commandant, the brutal and arrogant Sieur de Chapar, had already shown himself to be a man without honor, without wisdom, and without mercy. How long could peace endure? Outside, in the village below the mounds, life continued as it had for centuries. Women ground corn in wooden mortars, their rhythmic pounding like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Children played stick-ball in the central plaza. Men returned from hunting, carrying deer and turkey. The great temple mound rose against the sky, topped by the sacred building where the eternal fire burned, tended by priests who had inherited their duties from ancestors stretching back into the mists of time. But change had come to the land of the Natchez. It had begun 28 years earlier, in 1697, when the first French explorers had paddled their canoes past the Natchez bluffs. The Natchez, from their high ground, had watched these strange men with their black robes and metal weapons. Some of the elders remembered stories from their grandfathers about other pale men, the Spanish under Hernando de Soto who had passed through their lands generations before, bringing death and disease. The French had been different at first. They wanted to trade. They offered wonderful things, iron kettles that didn't break like pottery, knives that held an edge sharper than any stone, cloth that was softer than deerskin, and most fascinating of all, guns. The Natchez had enemies, the Chickasaw to the north, raiding parties from distant tribes. These French weapons could protect them, but with the French came their hunger for land. Welcome to Historic Crimes TV, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past which helped shape the history of the world that we are living in. Before we begin, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The village called White Apple lay 3 miles from the grand village where the great sun ruled. It was here, in 1729, that the seeds of destruction were sown by a man whose name would be cursed by both French and Natchez alike, Sieur de Chapar. Chapar had arrived at Fort Rosalie, the French outpost overlooking the Natchez territory in 1728, replacing the previous commandant. Where his predecessor had been diplomatic, Chapar was tyrannical. Where compromise had once ruled, now there was only the commandant's will, backed by the threat of French muskets. On a humid morning in September 1729, Chapar rode to White Apple village with 6 soldiers. The village chief, a man the French called the Son of White Apple, received them with traditional hospitality, offering tobacco and food. But Chapar had not come to feast. "This land," Chapar announced, gesturing broadly at the village and the rich fields beyond, "I am claiming it. I will build my plantation here. You have until the harvest moon to move your people." The translator, a mixed-blood man named Pierre, hesitated before speaking the words in the Natchez tongue. He knew what they meant. White Apple wasn't just any village, it was sacred ground. The burial mounds of the ancestors lay here. The fields had been cultivated for generations. To abandon it would be to abandon the spirits of the dead, to break faith with the eternal cycle that bound the Natchez to their land. The Son of White Apple stood silent for a long moment. He was a man in his 50s, his face tattooed with the symbols of his noble rank, his body scarred from a lifetime of warfare and ritual. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but those who knew him could hear the rage beneath. The great sun must hear of this. We cannot decide such a matter without consulting our chief. Shapar's face reddened. I don't need permission from your so-called great son. I am the commandant of Fort Rosalie, representative of King Louis XV of France. This land now belongs to the king. He turned his horse and rode back toward the fort, leaving the village in stunned silence. That night, runners carried the news to the grand village. The great son, a man who had tried to follow his brother's advice to maintain peace, felt the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. Around him, his council of lesser sons, the nobility of the Natchez, argued fiercely. We must kill them all, shouted one young warrior, a man named Old Hare, whose sister had been raped by French soldiers 2 years earlier. They take our land, they abuse our women, they treat us like slaves. How much longer must we endure? An older chief, scared and wise, shook his head. Tattooed Serpent warned us. If we kill these French, more will come. They will bring an army that will destroy us completely. Then we die as men. Old Hare responded. Better to die fighting than to watch our people fade away, our land stolen, our sacred places defiled. The great sun raised his hand for silence. The firelight flickered across his face, casting shadows that made him look older than his years. The weight of leadership, the burden of being the earthly representative of the sun itself, had never felt heavier. We will try once more to talk to the Shapar, he said finally. We will offer him gifts. We will appeal to his reason. And if that fails... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Every man in that council house knew what lay ahead if diplomacy failed. The sacred fire would demand blood. The weeks that followed were a dance of deception and preparation. On the surface, life continued normally. Natchez hunters brought gifts to Fort Rosalie, deer meat, turkey, even a bear hide for the commandant. They smiled and spoke of friendship. Shapar, vain and foolish, believed their sudden generosity meant they had accepted his demands. But in the villages, in the secret gatherings after dark, a different story was unfolding. The conspiracy began with a meeting of the chiefs from the different Natchez villages. Beyond White Apple and the Grand Village, there were settlements at Genzanock, Grigra, and Tu. Each had its own chief, but all acknowledged the supremacy of the Great Sun. The question now was whether the Great Sun would give his blessing to what many saw as necessary, the complete destruction of the French presence in Natchez territory. The key to the plot was a woman whose name history would remember as the Sun Woman, or sometimes as the woman chief of White Apple. She was the mother of the son of White Apple, a woman of the highest noble rank, whose word carried weight equal to any male chief. She had lost a son to French brutality years earlier, and her hatred of the invaders was absolute. It was she who proposed the plan that would become the Natchez Revolt. We must strike all at once, she told the assembled chiefs. Not just here, but everywhere the French have settled along the river. We must send secret messengers to the Choctaw, to the Yazoo, to the Korowa and Tu. On the same day, at the same hour, we will rise up and kill every Frenchman in Louisiana. Without warning. Without mercy. We will drive them back across the great water forever. The chiefs listened, some nodding, others looking troubled. The great sun sat at the center, his face unreadable. The Choctaw will not join us, one chief objected. They trade too much with the French. They have become soft. Then we will send them gifts to persuade them, the Sun Woman replied. We have time. The harvest is not yet complete. We will set the date for after the harvest, when our granaries are full and we can sustain a long war if needed. In the other French forts, another chief asked. There are French at Natchez, at Mobile, at New Orleans. We cannot reach them all. We don't need to, the Sun Woman said, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. We strike here, at Fort Rosalie, and at the nearby settlements. Once the French see what happens when they push us too far, once they see their people slaughtered and their fort in flames, they will think twice about returning. The Great Sun finally spoke. And what of the French who have been our friends? The traitor Antoine Bailly, who has always dealt fairly with us. The families who have lived peacefully among us. The Sun Woman's face hardened. There can be no exceptions. If we show mercy to some, others will escape and warn the rest. It must be complete, or it will fail. The debate continued through the night. Some argued for mercy, for sparing the women and children. Others, remembering French atrocities, demanded total war. In the end, a compromise of sorts emerged. They would try to spare some of the women and children by taking them as captives. The men would die. All of them. The date was set, the morning of November 28, 1729, when the corn festival would provide cover for warriors from all the villages to gather at the grand village without arousing French suspicion. As October turned to November, a complex web of intrigue spread across French Louisiana. Natchez messengers, carrying bundles of sticks to count down the days until the attack, traveled secretly to the Choctaw villages, to the Yazoo settlements, to the Korowa and Sioux. Each bundle of sticks represented a day. Each day, one stick would be removed, until none remained. Then the killing would begin. But the conspiracy faced challenges from the start. Among the Choctaw, opinions were divided. Some villages, angry at French trading practices and land encroachment, agreed to join. Others, particularly those who had developed close relationships with French traders, refused. A Choctaw chief named Red Shoe, who had grown wealthy from the French trade, was particularly opposed. He sent secret warnings to the French at Mobile, but his messengers were vague and the French authorities dismissed them as rumors. Closer to Fort Rosalie, another problem emerged. A young Natchez woman named Catherine, who had been baptized by French missionaries and had taken a French name, was in love with a French soldier. As the conspiracy grew, she learned of it through whispered conversations she was never meant to hear. Torn between her people and her heart, she agonized over what to do. In early November, she slipped into Fort Rosalie at night and sought out the soldier, a man named Antoine Desroches. "You must warn the commandant," she whispered urgently. "My people plan to attack. Soon. Very soon." Desroches, young and skeptical, laughed it off. "The Natchez? They've been bringing us gifts every week. Just yesterday, the great sun himself presented Commandant Chapar with a calumet of peace. You're worrying over nothing." "Please," Catherine begged. "I have heard the warriors talking. They speak of killing all the French. You must believe me." But Desroches didn't believe her, or perhaps he didn't want to believe her, because accepting her warning would mean acknowledging that his comfortable life in Louisiana was built on fragile ground. He promised to mention it to the commandant, but his tone suggested he wouldn't. Catherine left the fort that night in tears, knowing she had failed. She would disappear into the forest before the attack, unable to bear witness to what was coming. Others also sensed the gathering storm. Several French colonists, living on isolated plantations along the river, reported that their Natchez neighbors had become distant, unwilling to meet their eyes. The Natchez workers who had labored in French fields stopped showing up. When questioned, they made vague excuses about family obligations or religious ceremonies. But Chapar, arrogant and dismissive, ignored all warnings. When a French priest, Father Philippe, came to him with concerns about unusual activity in the Natchez villages, Chapar waved him away. "These savages know who their masters are," Chapar said confidently. "They've been bringing me gifts. Just last week, the Great Sun sent me 3 deerskins and a bear hide. They're trying to bargain for better terms on the White Apple land, that's all. Let them try. In the end, they'll accept what I decide to give them." The priest persisted. "But Commandant, I've heard rumors." "Rumors? Old women's gossip." Chapar interrupted. "I've been in the colonies long enough to know how to handle these people. Fear and firmness, Father. That's what they understand. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Father Philippe left the commandant's office troubled. He was a Jesuit, a man who had learned several native languages and had tried to understand the people he ministered to. Unlike many of the French colonists, he had genuine friendships among the Natchez. One of them, a Christian convert named Pierre-François, had hinted at something dark approaching. "Father," Pierre-François had said, "you should leave. Go to New Orleans. Soon. Why? The priest had asked. What's happening? But Pierre-François had said no more, his face closed and sad. As November progressed, the signs became impossible to ignore, for those who had eyes to see. The Natchez women, who usually came to the French settlements to trade baskets and pottery, stopped coming. Natchez children, who had played with French children, disappeared. The paths between the French plantations and the Natchez villages, usually busy with traffic, grew empty and silent. Still, Chapar remained oblivious. On November 20th, just 8 days before the planned attack, he hosted a feast at the fort. He invited several Natchez chiefs, including the great son himself. They came, smiled, ate French food, and toasted to continued friendship. Chapar, drunk on wine and his own sense of superiority, boasted to his officers afterward. You see? I told you there was nothing to worry about. The Natchez know their place. By spring, I'll have my plantation at White Apple, and these savages will be working my fields. That's how you handle them with strength. But while Chapar celebrated, the Natchez chiefs who had attended his feast returned to their villages and reported to the war council. The final preparations were made. Warriors sharpened tomahawks and war clubs. Women prepared food for a long campaign. The sacred fire in the temple was fed with special offerings, and prayers were said to the spirits of the ancestors. The great son, in the privacy of his dwelling, made his own prayers. He thought of his brother, Tattooed Serpent, and wondered if this was the catastrophe his brother had foreseen. But the choice had been made. Chapar's arrogance had sealed the fate of his people. 8 days remained. November 28, 1729, dawned cold and gray. A thick fog rolled off the Mississippi River, blanketing Fort Rosalie and the scattered French plantations in a ghostly shroud. Inside the fort, Commandant Chapar rose early, annoyed by the weather but looking forward to the day's business. He had no idea it would be his last day alive. The morning began normally enough. French soldiers emerged from their barracks, grumbling about the cold. Settlers from nearby plantations began arriving at the fort, as they often did, to trade and socialize. The fort itself was a modest structure, wooden palisades enclosing a few buildings, a warehouse for trade goods, barracks for the soldiers, and the commandant's residence. Outside the fort, perhaps 100 French colonists lived on plantations stretching along the river bluffs. They grew tobacco, indigo, and corn. Many employed Natchez laborers, paying them in trade goods. Some had Natchez wives or mistresses. A few even considered themselves friends to the Indians. None of them knew that this day had been chosen as their last. In the grand village, warriors were gathering. They came in small groups, trying not to attract attention, assembling at the house of the great sun under the pretense of the corn festival. By mid-morning, more than 400 warriors had arrived, armed with war clubs, tomahawks, bows, and a few guns obtained through trade. The great sun, dressed in his ceremonial regalia, the crown of swan feathers, the cloak of white feathers representing his divine connection to the sun, addressed the warriors one final time. Today, he said, his voice carrying across the assembled men, we take back what is ours. Today, we send a message that the Natchez will not be slaves in their own land. The French have pushed us too far. They have taken our land, abused our people, and shown us nothing but contempt. Today, we show them the price of their arrogance. The warriors raised their weapons and voices in a war cry that echoed across the village. Old women ululated. The priests brought torches from the sacred fire, and warriors touched their weapons to the flames, blessing them for battle. The plan was simple but required precise coordination. The warriors were divided into groups, each with a specific target. One group would attack Fort Rosalie itself. Another would strike the French settlements along the river. Others would hit the outlying plantations simultaneously, ensuring no one could escape to warn the rest. The signal for the attack would be the sound of gunfire from the fort. At Fort Rosalie, Commandant Chapar was meeting with several Natchez chiefs who had requested an audience. They brought gifts, more deerskins, some pottery, baskets of corn. Chapar, pleased with himself, accepted the gifts graciously. He didn't notice that the chiefs kept glancing toward the door, or that more and more Natchez people were entering the fort compound, ostensibly to trade. Among the French soldiers, Private Jean Roussin noticed something odd. He was standing guard at the gate and had counted at least 50 Natchez men entering in the past hour. Most claimed to be bringing goods to trade, but they carried bundles that seemed too light, and their eyes were watchful, alert. "Corporal," Roussin called to his superior, "I don't like this. Too many of them are coming in." The corporal, a veteran named LeBlanc, looked around and frowned. "You're right. Something's off. Where's Antoine? He knows their language. Let's ask him what's going on." But before they could find the interpreter, the signal came. One of the Natchez chiefs in Chapar's office suddenly produced a war club from beneath his robe and brought it down on the commandant's head. Chapar, too shocked even to cry out, crumpled to the floor. At the same moment, Natchez warriors throughout the fort threw off their blankets, revealing weapons. Gunshots rang out. The massacre had begun. Private Roussin, hearing the shots, tried to close the gate, but Natchez warriors swarmed through, overwhelming him. Corporal LeBlanc managed to fire his musket once before being struck down by 3 warriors wielding tomahawks. The French soldiers, scattered and surprised, tried to fight back, but they were outnumbered 10-1. Inside the fort, it was chaos. French colonists who had come to trade ran screaming for the palisade walls. Some made it over, most didn't. The Natchez warriors, their blood up, showed no mercy. Men were killed where they stood. Women screamed as they were dragged away. Children cried for parents who would never answer. One French trader, Antoine Bailly, the man the great son had mentioned as having been fair to the Natchez, tried to reason with the warriors attacking him. "Wait. I've always treated you fairly. I've never cheated you." A warrior paused, recognition in his eyes. But another warrior pushed past him and split Bailey's skull with a tomahawk. "Fair trade means nothing when you stand on stolen land," the warrior said. Throughout the fort and the surrounding plantations, similar scenes unfolded. French families sitting down to breakfast were set upon without warning. Men working in fields looked up to see warriors emerging from the tree line. Isolated farmhouses became slaughterhouses. But not all the French died easily. At one plantation, a former soldier named Jacques Dubois managed to barricade himself in his house with his wife and 2 children. He had 3 muskets and plenty of powder. For 6 hours, he held off repeated Natchez attacks, killing 3 warriors and wounding several others. Finally, the Natchez set fire to the house. Dubois and his family perished in the flames. At another plantation, a woman named Marie de Noyen saved herself and her children through quick thinking. When warriors burst into her house, she immediately fell to her knees and began speaking in halting Natchez, begging for her life. She reminded the warriors that she had nursed several Natchez children through illness the previous winter, using her knowledge of herbs. One of the warriors, whose own daughter Marie had saved, lowered his tomahawk. "Take her and the children prisoner," he ordered. "She has earned her life." Marie and her children were marched to the Grand Village, where they joined other French captives, mostly women and children, along with a handful of men who had been spared for various reasons. By noon, the killing was essentially over. Of approximately 240 French colonists in the Natchez district, at least 230 were dead. The warriors had been ruthlessly efficient. Fort Rosalie was in Natchez hands. The warehouse full of French trade goods, guns, powder, cloth, tools was plundered. The French flag was torn down and burned. In the commandant's office, Chapar's body lay where it had fallen, his skull crushed. The last thing he had seen was the face of a Natchez chief he had considered pacified, smiling as he brought the war club down. As the sun climbed higher on November 28, the full scope of the uprising became clear. The Natchez hadn't struck alone. Coordinating with the bundle of sticks, other tribes had risen simultaneously. At Fort St. Peter, among the Yazoo Indians about 150 miles north of Fort Rosalie, the French garrison of 17 soldiers was massacred. The Yazoo warriors, longtime allies of the Natchez, had followed their own bundle of sticks countdown. The French Jesuit missionary Father Sewell was tomahawked while saying morning prayers. The commandant and his men were killed in their sleep. Among the Korowa and Ute tribes, smaller attacks claimed more French lives. Isolated traders and missionaries were killed. French supply boats traveling the Mississippi were ambushed. Within days, more than 250 French colonists and soldiers were dead across the lower Mississippi Valley. But the larger plan, the grand alliance that the Sun Woman had envisioned, failed to materialize. The Choctaw, despite initial promises from some villages, ultimately refused to join the uprising. Several factors contributed to their decision: the influence of chiefs like Red Shoe who valued French trade, warnings from French officials who offered better trading terms in exchange for loyalty, and traditional rivalries with the Natchez that outweighed their shared grievances against the French. Most critically, the Chickasaw, powerful enemies of the Natchez, immediately offered their services to the French as allies against the uprising. The Chickasaw had no love for the French, but they had even less love for the Natchez, with whom they had feuded for generations. Back at the Grand Village, the Natchez held a council to decide what to do with their victory. The euphoria of success was already giving way to uncertainty. They had struck a devastating blow, but what came next? The captured French colonists, about 50 women, children, and enslaved Africans, were brought before the Great Sun. Some of the warriors wanted to kill them all, to complete the work of driving out every trace of French presence. Others argued for keeping them as slaves or hostages. The Great Sun, looking at the terrified prisoners, felt the weight of his decision. Among them was Madame de la Loire, wife of the former lieutenant of the fort. She stood with dignity despite her fear, holding her 2 young daughters close. Spare the women and children, the Great Sun finally decided. They did not steal our land. They did not beat our people. Hold them safe. They may be useful in negotiations. Negotiations? Old Hare, the young warrior who had long advocated for war, spoke up angrily. Negotiate with whom? We've killed their commandant, destroyed their fort. Do you think they'll negotiate with us now? They'll come with an army to destroy us. The Great Sun knew Old Hare was right, but admitting it would be admitting that they had embarked on a path that could only end in their own destruction. Tattooed Serpent's warning echoed in his mind: the French are like the leaves of the forest, too many to count. News of the Natchez revolt reached New Orleans on December 2nd, carried by a handful of French colonists who had escaped the massacre. They arrived in pirogues, exhausted and traumatized, telling stories of horror and betrayal. Governor Etienne Purrier, who had governed Louisiana since 1727, was stunned. The Natchez had always been considered one of the more civilized tribes, relatively peaceful, good for trade. That they would commit such an atrocity seemed impossible. But as more survivors trickled in, each telling similar stories, the truth became undeniable. Purrier faced a crisis. The Louisiana colony was small, poor, and undermanned. He had perhaps 700 regular soldiers and militia in the entire colony, scattered across multiple posts. New Orleans itself could muster maybe 300 fighting men. To mount an expedition against the Natchez, he would need to strip garrisons from other forts, leaving them vulnerable. Moreover, the uprising threatened the very survival of French Louisiana. If other tribes followed the Natchez example, if the rebellion spread, the entire colony could be lost. France had invested enormous sums in Louisiana, hoping it would become a profitable venture. A successful Indian uprising would not only be a military disaster but an economic and political catastrophe. Purrier acted quickly. He dispatched urgent messages to France, begging for reinforcements. He sent envoys to the Choctaw, offering generous gifts and better trading terms in exchange for military assistance. He ordered all French settlements to fortify their positions and be on alert for further attacks, and he began planning revenge. We must make an example of the Natchez, Purrier told his council of officers and colonial officials. We must show every tribe in Louisiana what happens when they raise their hands against France. Total war, no mercy. We will destroy them so completely that their very name will become a warning to others. But Purrier faced logistical nightmares. It was now December, and winter was setting in. The Mississippi River, while navigable, was dangerous in winter storms. Supplies were limited in the Natchez, having captured Fort Rosalie's warehouse, now possessed significant amounts of French weapons and ammunition. As Purrier planned, the Natchez were also debating their next move. Opinion in the council was divided. Some wanted to press their advantage, attack other French positions before reinforcements could arrive. Others argued for consolidating their defenses and preparing for the inevitable French counterattack. The Sun woman, whose voice carried great weight, advocated for an aggressive strategy. "We should strike at New Orleans itself," she argued. "The French are weak. If we move quickly, we can drive them from Louisiana entirely. The Spanish in Texas will not interfere. The English in Carolina are too far. This is our moment." But the Great Sun was more cautious. He had been counting the French weapons captured from Fort Rosalie. They had perhaps 200 muskets, but limited ammunition. More importantly, not all Natchez warriors knew how to use firearms effectively. Their traditional weapons, bows, war clubs, tomahawks were deadly at close range but useless in siege warfare. "We cannot take New Orleans," he said flatly. "It is fortified. They have cannons and the Choctaw will not help us. They have chosen the French side. We should prepare to defend our villages and negotiate from a position of strength." "Negotiate?" Old Hare said scornfully. "After what we've done? They'll want nothing but our heads." As December passed, both sides prepared for the coming war. Purrier managed to assemble a force of about 700 men, a mix of French regular soldiers, colonial militia, and volunteer settlers seeking revenge. More importantly, he secured the alliance of the Choctaw, who contributed another 1,000 warriors. The Choctaw were motivated partly by French gifts but more by traditional enmity toward the Natchez and the opportunity to gain prestige and plunder. The French counterattack began in January 1730. Governor Purrier led the expedition personally, determined to crush the Natchez rebellion swiftly and brutally. His forces moved up the Mississippi River in a flotilla of boats and pirogues, carrying soldiers, supplies, and light artillery. The Natchez, alerted by scouts, watched the approaching French armada with growing dread. The Great Sun called an emergency council. The discussion was heated. "We should abandon the villages and scatter into the forest," one chief suggested. "Fight them from the shadows, ambush their patrols, bleed them slowly. And leave our sacred mounds to be desecrated," another chief responded angrily. "Leave the eternal fire to be extinguished? Never! We will fight here, on our land, in sight of our ancestors' graves." A compromise was reached. The women, children, and elderly would be evacuated to the far interior, where they would be safe. The warriors would fortify the Grand Village and the surrounding high ground, building stockades and earthworks. They would make the French pay dearly for every inch of land. The French arrived at the Natchez Bluffs on January 25, 1730. Purrier, surveying the Natchez fortifications through his spyglass, felt a grudging respect for their preparations. The Natchez had built a formidable fort on the high ground, with wooden palisades and firing platforms. They had positioned their captured French artillery, several small cannons to cover the approaches. But Purrier had superior numbers, better weapons, and professional soldiers. More importantly, he had artillery of his own, including several 6-pound cannons that could demolish wooden fortifications. The siege of the Natchez began with an artillery bombardment. The French cannons roared, sending iron shots crashing into the Natchez palisades. The Natchez defenders returned fire with muskets and their own captured cannons, but their shooting was inaccurate. The captured French artillery pieces were operated by Natchez warriors who had never trained on them, and their shots often flew wide. For 3 days, the French bombarded the Natchez fortifications while their Choctaw allies probed for weaknesses. The Choctaw warriors, eager for glory and plunder, launched several assaults on the stockade but were repulsed with significant losses. The Natchez defenders, fighting for their very survival, fought with desperate courage. Inside the fort, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The French cannonballs had started fires that consumed several buildings. Water was running short. Ammunition was dwindling. Worst of all, the warriors could see more French and Choctaw forces arriving daily, swelling Puryear's army to over 2,000 men. On the fourth day of the siege, a French cannonball struck the base of one of the palisade walls, creating a breach. Choctaw warriors rushed the gap, screaming their war cries. The Natchez defenders fought them hand-to-hand in brutal close combat. For an hour, the battle raged at the breach, men dying on both sides in the narrow killing ground. Finally, the Choctaw were pushed back, but the Natchez had suffered heavy casualties. That night, the Great Sun called another council. The situation was hopeless. They could hold out for perhaps another week, but the end was inevitable. "We should negotiate," the Great Sun said quietly. "We should offer to return the French prisoners in exchange for safe passage for our people." "No!" Old Hare shouted. "We fight to the last man. Better to die as warriors than to beg for mercy we will never receive." But the Great Sun had made his decision. At dawn, a white flag was raised over the Natchez fort. The negotiations that followed were tense and bitter. Governor Puryear agreed to meet with the Great Sun under a flag of truce, but his terms were harsh. "You will surrender unconditionally," Puryear declared. "You will release all French prisoners. You will give up all weapons and you will submit to French justice for the massacre at Fort Rosalie." The Great Sun, standing before the French governor in his ceremonial regalia but clearly defeated, tried to negotiate better terms. "We will release the prisoners. We will accept a French presence at Fort Rosalie. But let our people go in peace. We will move to new lands, away from the French. There need be no more bloodshed." Puryear's face was stone. "You murdered over 200 French subjects. You think you can simply walk away? No. You will surrender, or I will reduce your fort to ashes with you inside it." The Great Sun returned to his people with a heavy heart. He explained Puryear's terms to the assembled warriors and chiefs. Some wanted to fight to the death. Others saw the wisdom in preserving what remained of their people. That night, while the council debated, something unexpected happened. A group of warriors, led by Old Hare and including many of the most militant fighters, made a bold decision. They would not surrender. Instead, they would break out of the siege under cover of darkness and flee to the west, toward the lands of the Chickasaw, ironically, their traditional enemies, or beyond to the Arkansas River country. "Any who wish to live free, come with us," Old Hare announced to the warriors. "We leave before dawn. Bring your families if you can. We will not be slaves to the French." The Great Sun was faced with an impossible choice. If he tried to stop them, it would mean civil war within his own people at the worst possible moment. If he let them go, it would weaken his negotiating position with Puryear and likely doom those who remained. He chose to let them go. In the pre-dawn darkness of February 5, 1730, approximately 300 Natchez warriors and their families slipped out of the fort through a concealed exit on the side facing away from the French lines. They moved silently through the forest, carrying what little they could, some weapons, food, and the sacred objects they could transport. Behind them, they left their homes, their ancestral burial mounds, and the temple where the eternal fire had burned for 1,000 years. The priests, unable to carry the sacred fire with them, performed one final ceremony. With tears streaming down their faces, they extinguished the eternal flame that had never gone dark in living memory. It was a spiritual catastrophe equivalent to the end of the world itself. When dawn broke and the French discovered the escape, Puryear was furious. He dispatched Choctaw trackers to pursue the fugitives, but the fleeing Natchez had a head start and knew the country well. Most would escape, at least for now. For those who remained, perhaps 400 warriors and their families, along with the Great Sun, the promised negotiation turned into a trap. When they emerged from the fort to formally surrender, French soldiers and Choctaw warriors immediately surrounded them. The warriors were disarmed and bound. The French prisoners were released, including Madame de la Loire and her daughters, who had survived their captivity relatively unharmed. Then Puryear revealed his true intentions. The surrendered Natchez would not be allowed to settle elsewhere. They would not be given new lands or permitted to live in peace. Instead, they would be enslaved. "You are now property of the French crown," Puryear announced. "You will be transported to our colonies in the Caribbean to work the sugar plantations. Your nation is dissolved. Your lands are forfeit. The Natchez people are finished." The great son, hearing these words, felt his world collapse. He had surrendered to save his people, and instead, he had delivered them into bondage. Warriors who had trusted his judgment looked at him with betrayal in their eyes. The Sun woman, who had advocated for aggressive warfare, spat at his feet. "You should have listened to your war chiefs," she said bitterly. "Now we are less than nothing. Slaves, better we had all died as warriors." Over the following weeks, the captive Natchez were marched in chains to New Orleans, then loaded onto ships bound for Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti. Families were separated, children were torn from mothers. Warriors who had once stood proud were beaten and shackled like animals. The great son was forced to watch his people's degradation. He was kept in slightly better conditions than the others, not out of respect, but because Puryear wanted to parade him as a trophy, proof of French dominance over the rebellious tribes. In March 1730, the ships departed New Orleans harbor. The great son stood on the deck, looking back at the land of his ancestors disappearing into the distance. He would never see it again. He would die in Saint-Domingue 5 years later, still in chains, his name and titles meaningless in the brutal world of the Caribbean sugar plantations. But the story of the Natchez did not end with the ships sailing away. Old Hare and his band of fugitive Natchez warriors moved through the winter forests like ghosts. They traveled mostly at night, covering their tracks, avoiding known trails. Behind them, Choctaw war parties pursued relentlessly, motivated by French bounties and the promise of plunder. The fugitives numbered about 300 at first, warriors, women, children, and elders who had chosen freedom over surrender. They carried few supplies and had to hunt and forage as they went. Winter in the Mississippi wilderness was harsh, and many of the elderly and very young did not survive the first weeks of flight. Old Hare, thrust into leadership by circumstance, proved to be a resourceful and determined commander. He divided his people into smaller groups to make them harder to track. He set ambushes for pursuing Choctaw parties, inflicting casualties that made the pursuers more cautious. He sought refuge among tribes who were neutral or hostile to the French. Their first destination was the country of the Chickasaw, several hundred miles to the north. It was a desperate gamble. The Chickasaw and Natchez had been enemies for generations, raiding each other's villages, taking captives, and killing warriors. But Old Hare hoped that shared opposition to French expansion might create a new alliance. The gamble paid off partially. The Chickasaw chief, a wily leader named Red Shoes, saw opportunity in the Natchez refugees. He allowed them to settle on the edges of Chickasaw territory, but not as equals but as subordinate clients. The Natchez would have to acknowledge Chickasaw supremacy and provide warriors for Chickasaw military campaigns. Old Hare accepted these humiliating terms. Survival came first, pride could wait. But not all the fugitives made it to Chickasaw country. One group, about 80 people, tried to reach the Arkansas River country to the west. They were caught by a combined force of French soldiers and Choctaw warriors near the Washita River. Only a handful escaped the massacre that followed. The rest were killed or captured and sent to New Orleans for transportation to the Caribbean slave markets. Another group tried to find refuge among the Choctaw themselves, hoping that some Choctaw villages might be sympathetic. It was a fatal miscalculation. The Choctaw, having committed themselves to the French alliance, could not afford to harbor Natchez refugees. The entire group, about 40 people, was handed over to the French. The warriors were executed, the women and children were enslaved. Through the spring and summer of 1730, the hunt continued. French Governor Puryear, determined to complete the destruction of the Natchez, placed bounties on Natchez scalps and offered rewards for Natchez captives. Choctaw and Chickasaw warriors, along with other tribes eager for French favor, scoured the wilderness. In the Chickasaw country, Old Hare and his followers tried to rebuild some semblance of their old life. They built small villages, planted corn, and taught their children the old ways. but they were living on borrowed time and borrowed land. The Chickasaw chiefs, while willing to shelter them for now, made clear that if the French pressure became too great, the Natchez would be sacrificed. Governor Puryear was not satisfied with the capture of the Great Sun and the enslavement of several hundred Natchez. As long as Old Hare and his fugitives remained free, the rebellion was not truly crushed. In the summer of 1730, he began planning a second campaign. This time, the target was not just the remaining Natchez but also a message to any tribe that might consider rebellion. Puryear wanted to demonstrate that there was no escape, no refuge, no mercy for those who raised their hands against France. The campaign was delayed by political complications. The Chickasaw, who were sheltering the Natchez refugees, were themselves a powerful nation with strong trading ties to the English colonies in Carolina. Attacking them directly risked provoking both the Chickasaw and their English allies, which could turn the Louisiana frontier into a larger war. Puryear tried diplomacy first. He sent envoys to the Chickasaw with demands: surrender the Natchez refugees, or face French military action. The Chickasaw response was defiant. They would not hand over people who had sought their protection. If the French wanted the Natchez, they would have to come and take them. But the Chickasaw were also pragmatic. They quietly encouraged Old Hare and his people to move further west, beyond Chickasaw territory, to reduce the friction with the French. Old Hare refused. He knew that moving deeper into the wilderness would only postpone the inevitable. Better to stay where they had some protection, however uncertain. In September 1730, Puryear launched his second campaign. This time, he assembled an even larger force, 800 French soldiers and militia, supplemented by over 1,000 Choctaw warriors. The army moved overland and by river toward Chickasaw territory. The Chickasaw, seeing the French force approaching, faced a difficult decision. They could fight alongside the Natchez refugees and risk total war with France, or they could step aside and let the French have their vengeance. After heated debates in their council, they chose a middle path. They would not actively help the French, but they would not fight them either. The Natchez refugees would be on their own. Old Hare, abandoned by his hosts, had perhaps 200 warriors left, along with several hundred women, children, and elders. He fortified a position on a bluff overlooking a creek, not a permanent village but a defensive strongpoint chosen for its tactical value. He knew it was hopeless, but he was determined to make the French pay for their victory. The Battle of Chickasaw Bluffs, as it would be remembered, began on October 7, 1730. The French, led by an experienced officer named Captain St. Denis, approached the Natchez position cautiously. They had learned from the earlier siege that the Natchez, even cornered and desperate, were dangerous fighters. The French artillery opened fire, bombarding the Natchez fortifications. But this time, the Natchez had no cannons to return fire. They had only muskets, bows, and their courage. For 2 days, they held off French assaults, inflicting casualties that shocked the attackers. Choctaw warriors, sent in wave after wave, were thrown back with heavy losses. But ammunition was running low. Food was gone. Water was scarce. On the third day, Old Hare called his warriors together one last time. "We have fought well," he told them. "Our ancestors watch us and are proud. But we cannot win. Tonight, we will attempt to break out. Every man for himself. Save your families if you can. If we scatter, some will survive. That is all we can hope for now." That night, under a new moon that provided blessed darkness, the Natchez attempted their breakout. Warriors, women, and children scattered in all directions, running through the French and Choctaw lines. Some made it through but many didn't. The forest became a killing ground. French soldiers and Choctaw warriors pursued the fleeing Natchez through the night and into the next day. Individual tragedies played out in the wilderness, mothers hiding their children in hollow logs, warriors making last stands to buy time for their families to escape, elderly people who could not keep up being left behind to face capture or death. Old Hare himself survived the initial breakout, leading a small group of warriors and their families deeper into the wilderness. They were pursued for days by a relentless Choctaw war party. Finally, Cornered at a river crossing, Old Hare and his remaining warriors made their last stand. The fight lasted less than an hour. Old Hare killed 3 Choctaw warriors before he was brought down by musket fire. He died as he had wished, fighting, on his feet, a free man. His body was scalped, and his head was cut off to be presented to Governor Puryear as proof of victory. Of the 200 warriors who had been at Chickasaw Bluffs, perhaps 50 escaped. The rest were killed or captured. The women and children who were taken alive were marched back to New Orleans and sold into slavery. Some were sent to the Caribbean. Others became enslaved servants in French Louisiana households, stripped of their identity, forbidden to speak their language or practice their religion. By the end of 1730, the Natchez as a distinct nation had ceased to exist. Their lands were occupied by French colonists. Their grand village was deserted, the temple mounds standing empty. Fort Rosalie was rebuilt and reinforced, renamed Fort Rosalie de Natchez as a reminder of French triumph over rebellion. But the Natchez people themselves survived, scattered across the American South like seeds thrown by a violent wind. Small groups, sometimes just a few families, found refuge among other tribes. Some merged with the Chickasaw, losing their distinct identity over time but preserving fragments of their culture. Others were absorbed into Creek, Cherokee, or even Choctaw communities, their Natchez heritage becoming a whispered memory passed down through generations. One group of about 100 Natchez, led by a chief named Flower, managed to reach the territory of the Creek Confederacy in what is now Alabama and Georgia. The Creek, a powerful alliance of tribes, accepted them as allies. These Natchez refugees built new villages, married into Creek clans, and maintained their identity as Natchez in exile. Their descendants would still identify as Natchez over a century later. Another small group reached the lands of the Cherokee in the Appalachian Mountains. The Cherokee, while cautious of these refugees from a failed rebellion, allowed them to settle on marginal lands. Over time, they too were absorbed into Cherokee society, but Cherokee oral traditions would remember the people who fought the French. Yet another remnant reached French Louisiana settlements and, in a bitter irony, some Natchez survivors sought protection from the very people who had destroyed them. They became detribalized individuals, working as laborers, guides, or translators. They married French colonists or enslaved Africans. Their children and grandchildren would have French or Spanish names, speak French or Spanish, and only dimly remember their Natchez heritage. The enslaved Natchez in the Caribbean plantations suffered perhaps the worst fate. Ripped from their homeland, forced to work in brutal conditions growing sugar cane, dying from disease and exhaustion, their culture was deliberately destroyed. Masters beat slaves who spoke native languages. Families were separated and sold. Within a generation, most of the enslaved Natchez had died, and their children, born into slavery, knew nothing of the Mississippi Bluffs where their ancestors had lived. But even in bondage, resistance persisted. In Saint-Domingue, enslaved Natchez participated in the Maroon community's escaped slaves living in the mountains beyond French control. When the Great Haitian Revolution erupted in 1791, 60 years after the Natchez Revolt, the descendants of enslaved Natchez warriors fought in the armies that would eventually win Haiti's independence. The spirit of resistance, it seemed, could not be entirely crushed. Governor Puryear returned to New Orleans in November 1730, declaring complete victory over the Natchez. He staged a triumphal parade through the muddy streets of the colonial capital. Choctaw warriors displayed Natchez scalps. French soldiers marched with captured Natchez weapons. Puryear himself rode at the head of the procession, presenting Old Hare's severed head as proof that the rebellion had been crushed. The colonists cheered. The threat that had terrorized them for a year was ended. The Natchez, who had dared to rise up against French authority, had been destroyed. It seemed like a great victory, but the costs of that victory would haunt French Louisiana for decades. The Natchez campaign had been enormously expensive. Puryear had depleted Louisiana's treasury to fund 2 military expeditions. The colony was effectively bankrupt. Ships full of Natchez slaves sent to Saint-Domingue barely covered a fraction of the costs. France would have to send more money, more supplies, more colonists to make Louisiana viable again. More importantly, the brutal suppression of the Natchez had sent shockwaves through the Native American nations of the Southeast. Tribes that had been neutral or even friendly to France now watched with wary eyes. The message was clear: the French would tolerate no dissent, no resistance. Submit completely, or be destroyed. Some tribes drew the lesson Purrier intended. They became more compliant, more careful in their dealings with the French. But others drew a different conclusion: the French were dangerous enemies who could never be trusted, and alliances with the English in Carolina or the Spanish in Florida might be necessary for survival. The Chickasaw, in particular, moved decisively toward the English. Having seen how the French treated the Natchez, who were former allies turned rebels, the Chickasaw wanted nothing to do with French power. They strengthened their trade ties with Carolina, obtained more English weapons, and prepared for the inevitable conflict with France. That conflict would come in the Chickasaw Wars of the 1730s and 1740s, costly campaigns that would drain French Louisiana's resources even further. The Choctaw, despite their alliance with France during the Natchez crisis, became more demanding. They had done the bulk of the fighting in both campaigns. They expected to be rewarded with generous trade terms, gifts, and diplomatic respect. When French traders tried to return to their old practices of short-weighting goods and charging excessive prices, Choctaw chiefs reminded them pointedly that they had other options. British traders from Carolina were always ready to offer better deals. Within French Louisiana itself, the Natchez revolt had shattered the illusion of colonial security. Settlers now knew that even tribes considered civilized and friendly could turn violent. Every Native American servant was potentially a spy. Every Native American trading partner was potentially an enemy in waiting. The easy, if unequal, coexistence that had characterized early Louisiana was replaced by suspicion and fear. Militarily, Louisiana had to maintain larger garrisons, build more forts, and keep more soldiers on alert. This was expensive in a colony that had never turned a profit. The French crown, already stretched thin by European wars and struggling colonial ventures in other parts of the world, grew increasingly frustrated with Louisiana's endless demands for money and troops. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence was demographic. The Natchez revolt had killed or displaced a large portion of the colony's French population. The massacre of November 28, 1729, had claimed over 230 French lives, more than 10% of the colony's European population, in a single day. Many potential settlers, hearing of the massacre, chose to emigrate elsewhere. Louisiana's growth stagnated. To replace the lost population, French authorities increasingly relied on enslaved Africans. The proportion of enslaved people in Louisiana's population grew dramatically in the decades after the Natchez revolt. This demographic shift would have profound consequences for Louisiana's culture, society, and eventual history. The colony that emerged from the ashes of the Natchez crisis was increasingly a slave society, dependent on African labor and terrified of both Native American and African resistance. Governor Purrier himself would be recalled to France in 1733, his tenure judged a mixed success at best. He had crushed the Natchez revolt, yes, but at enormous cost. Louisiana was poorer, weaker, and more divided than when he had arrived. His successors would struggle for decades to repair the damage. In the years immediately following the revolt, the scattered Natchez communities faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives in hostile circumstances. The refugees who had found shelter among the Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Creek nations had to navigate complex diplomatic and social situations. Among the Chickasaw, the Natchez refugees were valuable but vulnerable assets. The Chickasaw used their presence as leverage in negotiations with both the French and the English. To the French, the Chickasaw could offer to hand over Natchez refugees in exchange for trade concessions. To the English, they could present themselves as protectors of peoples resisting French tyranny, deserving of English support. A Natchez leader named White Earth, who had survived the breakout at Chickasaw Bluffs, emerged as a key diplomatic figure in this new world. He traveled to Charleston, South Carolina, in 1732, meeting with English colonial officials. Through interpreters, he told his story of how the French had stolen Natchez lands, provoked war, and then enslaved his people. The English, always happy to hear stories that made the French look bad, received him warmly. "We offer you our warriors," White Earth told the English governor. "We will fight alongside you against the French. All we ask in return is protection and a place to live in peace." The English made promises, some of which they kept, many of which they didn't. They provided some weapons and supplies to the Chickasaw-Natchez alliance. They encouraged resistance to French expansion. But when the French launched major campaigns against the Chickasaw in 1736 and 1739, English military support was minimal. The Chickasaw and their Natchez allies fought largely alone, though they fought successfully, repelling French invasions both times. Among the Creek Confederacy, the Natchez refugees led by Flower followed a different path. They embraced Creek political structures while maintaining their distinct identity. They provided Creek towns with skilled warriors and valuable intelligence about French movements and intentions. In return, they were given land and protection. Some Natchez men married Creek women, and their children were raised as Creek but taught to remember their Natchez heritage. This diaspora strategy of scattering, adapting, surviving through diplomacy and intermarriage would characterize Natchez history for the next century. They became what anthropologists call a relict population, a people whose political power was destroyed but whose cultural memory persisted.